these times. And so even as I thought, some time ago about what I would want to discuss with you all, I wanted to just acknowledge and commemorate and remind us to look back to the history and legacy of the 1964 Freedom Summer Campaign. And here we are. Here we are. I don't know how you all are feeling, but for many of us, especially this week, and even before, people are confused, disappointed, disillusioned, fearful, angry, enraged. And the good news is that we have inherited a legacy of resistance and brilliance. We have blueprints for strategies. Our ancestors survived, fascism. That was the Jim Crow South. And so it's really meaningful for me to then have this conversation at this time with you all. And so I thank you for joining me today. I am definitely a Black history nerd. As you can tell, I have 3 degrees in Black studies, and I say I have another one from the community in terms of being raised in Black studies spaces outside of the ivory tower, in bookstores and community centers. When I was a child, I actually did have an opportunity when I was 13 to attend a Saturday school called Know Your History. It was sponsored by the alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi. And so even when our schools are been refusing to teach Black history and culture and a robust and multicultural curriculum, people, we still do that work. We do that work wherever we are. And definitely Freedom Summer reminds us of that. I just joined the faculty at Howard University, and so I'm back home in my hometown in Washington, D.C., in the area. And I've been thinking a lot about being raised in Southeast D.C. and how that was a grounding for my Black history education. I went to all-Black elementary school when D.C. was Chocolate City. It's no longer Chocolate City quite anymore. But in my elementary school, every single day, we would learn Black history facts. It was a part of the morning announcements. And I was one of the little kids that would go on the PA system and read the Black history facts every day. And so it's, Black history education and culture is really in my DNA, is the work that I love. And so I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all today. I wanted to just ask, first of all, how many of you have heard of Freedom Summer or teach Freedom, have had an opportunity to teach Freedom Summer? Can you all put in the chat? Have you all been able to teach Freedom Summer, or at least have heard of Freedom Summer? What have you heard about Freedom Summer 1964? I know my introduction to Freedom Summer was actually the movie Mississippi Burning. You all remember this movie? It didn't focus on the activism and the institutions and the organizing that was happening in Mississippi. It focused on civil rights workers who were killed, and it featured the journalists who were trying to tell this story. So you say, many people say they've heard about it, but haven't been able to teach it. Some have taught it in US history, have taught it as a part of a history exhibit curriculum. Yes, the Freedom School in Pittsburgh has been doing work. Okay. I have taught hundreds of college students, and I still can't come up with 10 of them who have heard of Freedom Summer or had an opportunity to learn it. And I feel like a lot of times the way in which Freedom Summer has been swept under the rug or not really promoted in our education system has been intentional. And so I want to go over a brief history of Freedom Summer and then really pull out some of the lessons that have inspired me in my own teaching around Black freedom, liberation, and organizing for our times. So let me share my slides here. Hold on for 1 second. Can you all see this?
Yes, we can see it, Dr. Levy.
Okay. And so what I wanted to start off with really is Ida B. Wells, in order for the people to act, they must know. Um, this is something that really moves me in terms of thinking about political education and why spaces like this, are so critically important as we build our armor, expand our historical knowledge and political education to prepare for a liberated future. So this is an opportunity for us to return to the history and legacy of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. And what's interesting is that, we could think about it as a model and a guide. There were so many brilliant and courageous lessons that are especially relevant in 2024 and beyond. But I think of Freedom Summer as, and I've written about the Freedom Summer Project and Freedom Schools. It really is a remarkable and transformative and powerful radical moment in the civil rights movement. There are so many lessons that will feed us, inspire us, and move us to organize, to resist, to rebuild, and to innovate. We have, as I stated before, we have blueprints for change and transformation. But what's interesting, I think, is that it started off as a voter registration campaign that faced enormous challenges. And so, as you all know, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as this sort of the youth organization, brought a different perspective and strategies to the civil rights movement. And so as they were involved in direct action campaigns and expanded, the tool and strategy of direct action, going into Mississippi to start a voter registration drive was so terrible, and more so than any other place in the South, because you have people who were eligible to vote in Mississippi, Black people. Those numbers were so dismal compared to other places in the South. And so white racial terror was a big part of that, in terms of people were dying and being killed for trying to register to vote still. Economic deprivation was so entrenched in the environment in Mississippi. You had a deep-seated miseducation and lack of education for youth who were often forced to work in the fields and could not attend school when they had to sharecrop with their families. And of course, there were racist exclusions that shaped the political system throughout the state, where there were so many counties where Black people were the majority, but and had no opportunities to serve in leadership positions in their community. And so you had these barriers, and so it became important to create a voter registration drive that was multifaceted, right? So it had to have community programs. You have to deal with the problem of state violence. So the goal was to spotlight the violation of Black rights to citizenship and attract national and international attention and intervention. So when the student, and I should note that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led this campaign through COFO, which was the Council of Federated Organizations. It included the Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP. And they brought a dynamism, again, to the civil rights movement that changed the landscape that eventually led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But when they started off with this goal to register people to vote, realizing all of the barriers that they were facing, they ended up thinking about, okay, what do you do when people are hungry, are starving and don't have basic needs? You have to create community programs. You have to raise resources to feed people, to do food and clothing drives. What do you do in the face of people who are terrified because of white violence? Well, you have to organize in the white community, and there had not been any significant efforts to organize in white communities. Even though it was dangerous, it was much needed. People had to do research and collect information to tell the truth about the conditions in Mississippi. People were deeply miseducated, and their education was tied to the economic structure in Mississippi, where, again, youth were being lied to. They were straight up being lied to, in terms of this idea that Black people hadn't contributed anything to civilization, that Black people hadn't done anything that was noteworthy. And this is what justified the social, economic, and political arrangements in Mississippi and the Jim Crow South. And so they established freedom schools to not only teach people about their rights as citizens and understand the political system, but also to teach them about Black history, to teach them about their culture and ways to appreciate their culture. And so freedom schools became important in just in political education in order to prepare people to participate in the political process. But we also have the issue, once you get people to vote, who the hell are they going to vote for, right? And so they didn't have they couldn't afford to just rely on what we have accepted as the lesser of two evils. So people ran candidates, identified leaders in their communities who could be the true representatives of the people. And so they formed a political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And the MFDP, as it was called, had the goal of challenging white supremacy in the political process by sending delegates to the Democratic National Convention of 1964. So 1964 is an election year. And so this is critical, and it's an opportunity to, again, spotlight the dire conditions in Mississippi. And since white folks have been telling the lie that Black people in Mississippi are satisfied, they don't even want to participate in politics. We don't need a movement in Mississippi that is coming from the outside. We're happy here. And so part of what SNCC had done even before the 1964 Freedom Summer Project was to have mock elections. They identify indigenous and local leadership. And out of that, it really helps us to challenge who we think of as leaders. It challenges the classism that a lot of times it comes from that it was just ordinary, everyday people who know the best in terms of what the problems the people are facing and what solutions may be necessary. And so people that came out of that were like Fannie Lou Hamer, of course, Victoria Gray Adams, Unita Blackwell. These were everyday people, ordinary people that had put themselves in a position to say, we want to run for Congress. We are the ones who can best represent the people of Mississippi. And the Freedom Democratic Party was an interracial party. So it wasn't just a Black political party. And this was crucial, to go to the DNC and challenge the blatant violations of the constitutional rights of Black people. It's important to, I think, just to pull out some aspects of the movement in Mississippi focused on freedom schools or education as a primary battleground. The freedom schools and the MFDP were to be parallel institutions. But prior to that, SNCC activists created what was called Nonviolent High, while awaiting trial for students who refused, for instance, to sign a pledge that renounced civil rights activism in order to re-enter school. So as young people, high school students, college-age students were engaging in activism, they were getting kicked out of school. And so they created like a Nonviolent High as an alternative to the oppressive education system. SNCC learned that students were deeply miseducated about American history. And so when they were learning about the Civil War, in the South, they were calling it the War for Southern Independence, the war between the states. And so it was really important to think about how we frame our history, how we frame the stories we tell, these narratives, or as Julian Bond called them, master narratives that intentionally miseducate the youth. So the first freedom school, which we could argue was Nonviolent High, created a space for voices to be heard and accepted, regardless of class status and social position. The freedom schools, again, was this, parallel institution designed to inspire students to think critically about the conditions around them and around the world, and to make a link between the economic deprivation and exploitation that they were experiencing in Mississippi to the political system, to the economic system. And so it was really a way to show that these oppressive systems are intimately connected. coming out of the freedom schools, as Charles Cobb had conceived of it, he said that schooling was intellectual wastelands of non-think and no questions, where students would just take in information, regurgitate it, but they weren't being inspired to think critically or raise questions about the world around them. It was a system of miseducation and educational deprivation fundamentally linked to economic exploitation in Mississippi. That's how it was justified, to serve the economic power and power structure in Mississippi. And just reminding us that freedom schools were an innovation and a disruption. It was an indictment and a critique. It was an alternative and what Barbara Ransby calls a radical democratic vision. And the freedom schools are still with us today. I wanted to just emphasize looking at the numbers of inequality in Mississippi in terms of why it was necessary to even address the education system. On average, the state of Mississippi spent 4 times as much on white youth as than Black youth. Planters regulated access to schooling for Black and poor children, which required them to work in the fields. But then you had these dilapidated colored schools, right, that were grossly inadequate and unequal and had limited resources and outdated texts. And even when you looked at the text, you'll see things that were deeply disturbing and advancing the ideas of white supremacy. And so here's neither foreign languages nor civics shall be taught in Negro schools. That was the policy in Mississippi, nor shall American history from 1860 to 1875 be taught. And so these were the white folks in Mississippi trying to ban the history of, certain aspects of our history that can inspire young people to call for demand change. And we are in that moment. We are in that moment today. Just to give you some examples, in North Pike County, white people would spend for a white student, they would spend $30 per student versus 76 cents per Black student. In South Pike County, it was $59 per white student, $1.35 per Black student, all right? And so this was a huge disparities that we could see from 1960 Civil Rights Commission report. What is so important and so radical, I think, of that comes out of freedom schools was this mission to challenge the myths of society, And this philosophy, it has guided my teaching and practice in Black studies. And it definitely has inspired Black studies as a discipline. This idea that we have to combat miseducation and debunk it, that we challenge the myths of society. Here, Charles Cobb says, the goal was to fill an intellectual and creative vacuum in the lives of young Negro Mississippians and to get them to articulate their own ideas, demands, and questions, to stand up in classrooms around the state and ask their teachers a real question, to create an educational experience for students, which will make it possible for them to challenge the myths of society. So I'm going to just pause right here and ask you, what are some of the myths of society? What would you identify as some of the myths of society? Can you put in the chat for me? One, I'll just say the myth of democracy. What else y'all got? We have the myth of democracy. What else is a myth? Yes, that everyone has equal access and opportunity. The nonviolent nature of the civil rights movement. That's right, the myth of freedom. Meritocracy, oh my goodness, that's one that we really have to attack, the myth of a meritocracy. And these were exactly some of the issues that were brought up in the documents for Freedom School. I really love using notes on education, some notes on education by Charles Cobb. The myth of Black contentment and inferiority. Thank you, the myth of the American dream. And so just thinking about one way to engage our students is to think about the myths in society and how we might challenge them. To go on to question is to challenge, right? So that was the philosophy. To raise questions is to challenge. And so the freedom schools were proposed by Charles Cobb. He focused on youth as a strategy to politicize and radicalize students and also inspire the adults to get involved. So remember, people have been suffering not only economic exploitation, but extreme violence in Mississippi. And so Mississippi is one of those states that had a very high rate of lynching, for instance, beatings, bombings, you know. There are about 40 freedom schools that emerged from the project, more than 1,800 students ranging from toddlers to seniors. So people all in between. It was bigger than anything they had imagined. But those subjects included what was called Negro history at the time, Black history, civics, American history. They also brought in the arts, which was so critically important. So if you look at the Freedom Summer documents and see what the Freedom Schools produced, they had these students writing plays, poetry, they were doing music, you know, English, and of course, arithmetic, algebra, chemistry, all of these things. And so what Freedom Summer is mostly noted for are the white volunteers that came into Mississippi to join the movement. But there was already activism and organization on the ground in Mississippi that gets whitewashed or erased because we often focus on the white volunteers. And while that was an important strategy, it was not like Black Mississippians were doing nothing and then just accepting. There were Black people in Mississippi who were leaders, who were organizing and could not, and understood they could not do this by themselves. So we think about Amzie Moore, for instance, who brought it up, put a voting rights drive on the table for SNCC to get involved in Mississippi, as well as Medgar Evers, you know, who was assassinated in 1963 before, you know, the year before Freedom Summer. The other thing I wanted to pull out, so one of the first things that we could pull out from the Freedom Schools is to challenge the myths of society. But in those documents, I also really like to use these basic set of questions. So the initial focus is on two related sets of questions for Freedom Schools. The first set is, why are we, teachers and students in Freedom Schools? What is the freedom movement? And what alternatives does the freedom movement offer us? So it's an opportunity to engage students with the movement of their times, the civil rights movement. But the second set of questions, I think, is really an important intervention. And so the second set of questions says, what does the majority culture have that we want? What does the majority culture have that we don't want? What do we have that we want to keep? And usually I ask students to think about the nature of these questions and their implications. What do these questions convey? What do they mean? What do they do? You know, and part of it too, what young people end up recognizing is that, oh, we have a culture that is worth celebrating and retaining and preserving, that we don't necessarily want assimilation, that we do have a critique of the dominant majority culture that is white culture. And this was so important for Black Mississippians who, because of the lack of education, may have internalized ideas around Black inferiority. And so even in their speech and their music and their language, in the way that they you know, live their day to day. It was important to engage with young people or with students from the Freedom Schools to say, what is it about our culture that is beautiful? You know, that our culture is not inferior, that there is strength and beauty in the language, even though others might call it broken, you know? And so these basic set of questions, I think we can also, you know, amend them for our times, but to also just to think about, there are certain things in the dominant culture that we do not want, that we need to reject if we are going to survive. What is it that we want to keep? There are so many examples of what the students were able to produce out of these Freedom Schools that are really just empowering to think about. So Joyce Brown, who's 16 years old, she was frustrated with the adults in her community. And she wrote, this is a piece from her poem, that she created in the Freedom School. She said, I ask for your churches and you turn me down, but I do my work if I have to do it on the ground. You will not speak for fear of being heard, so you crawl in your shell and say, do not disturb. You've protected yourself for another day, but tomorrow surely will come and your enemy will still be there with the rising sun. He'll be there tomorrow as all tomorrows in the past, and he'll follow you into the future if you let him pass. And she goes on to build up this courage to say that the young people have courage that some of our elders do not. And that there were so many older folks, including pastors and these ministers who had church space, who were afraid to get involved. And she, instead of turning her critique onto the white folks, she turned them onto Black people who were in the way in the community. There are other examples that I think are have been really powerful in terms of bringing in some of these primary sources. And so I'm having a problem with my computer, so I'm gonna have to share it this way. Hold on, let me share again. Here I have the Civil Rights Movement vet.org website up. And so there are gazillion documents from Freedom Summer, included from Freedom Schools, as I've clicked on here, that could be beneficial to you as you are engaging students in this history. And so one that I really like a lot is the Declaration of Independence by the Freedom School students of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And so they were charged to write their own Declaration of Independence. And what's interesting to me is that they ask for equal opportunity, for better schools and equipment, for better recreation facilities. What you end up seeing in this declaration is that they're not asking for integration, as if, you know, they don't want barriers, but it's not about integrating into white spaces, you know? And so they want more Black policemen. They want guarantee of fair circuit court for integration in colleges and schools. But that's at the bottom of the list. You know, and so it also encourages to think about how the civil rights movement has been framed versus what people really wanted, especially among young people. Another document that I like to use, let's see if I have it up here, is I don't think I have it here, but they actually have, like, for instance, the application of Andrew Goodman. So again, the white volunteers was the focal point of Freedom School that we tend to remember. It was a strategy because as Black Mississippians, it was so dangerous for them to organize that it became imperative to say, well, let's get these white young people down here who are from wealthy families, who are from the top colleges like NYU, Columbia, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley. Let's see what if the nation would care and if they would be brutalized in the same way. And unfortunately, 3 civil rights workers were killed. James Chaney was a Black Mississippian who had been organizing in this community, along with Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner. And so there's an application of Andrew Goodman as a part of the primary source to kind of give, you know, humanize these stories that we tell, that he filled out this application 4 pages, you know, and then going through asking students, like, you know, what does it mean? Why would SNCC, you know, ask these questions about who can bail you out other than your parents? And then to see which projects they wanted to work on. And people did not want to work in white communities, like as that was part of the strategy. Even white folks were scared to go into white communities to do the organizing and to talk to people and to try to change their minds about integration. And so they brought these white young people into Mississippi knowing that white life matters. And these people, 3 other workers were killed, you know? And so that did bring a spotlight to Mississippi, but it also did not stop them. It could not stop them. And so some of the primary sources that you'll see is about the violence, documenting the kind of violence that people were beaten, people were jailed, another worker was killed. But even if Freedom Summer felt like it did not achieve its goals, there's still so much that it leaves for us in terms of a legacy of resistance. And so I want to come back to thinking about the MFDP before I open it up for discussion. Move on, just to give you some images of freedom schools. And so a lot of times they happened in churches, or the community spaces, wherever people could find them. But sometimes they happened outside, under trees, in the corners of someone's house. And you see people from all ages. What was really remarkable too is that while they got a lot of the white volunteers who came into Mississippi to teach freedom schools and they were teaching Black history, they learned themselves. And so many of them talk about how it was transformative for them, that they had the best education in the United States and had never learned anything about the contributions that Black people have made to society, and that they were transformed by that. And so it also showed the world that you can have integration and it be peaceful, that it would be mutually beneficial, and that people, Black and white people, can live in harmony. Another aspect of Freedom Summer was also the folk singers like Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, who helped to tell the story of what was happening in 1964 to a broader audience. Well, the other piece that is really important, I think, coming out of Freedom Summer is the elevation of women's intellectual and political work. And so Ella Baker, who was a mentor for SNCC, emphasized that strong people don't need strong leaders. Oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them and to see the world for what it is, to move it and to transform it. And so once we get to the MFDP, and you see someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who is so brilliant, and so powerful, but has a elementary school education, had to drop out of school to support her family as sharecroppers. And she talked about how in 1962 was the first time that she ever heard that Black people could even vote. And so while people were looking to folks like Martin Luther King Jr., who's a lot of times in our movement work, we think of the pastors as spokespersons. And so Freedom Summer really challenged that, to say that you can't wait on, these individuals or personalities, or to challenge the myth of charismatic male leadership. And so it is also an opportunity to engage students in thinking about local leaders, indigenous leaders, and women as leaders. So the myth of American democracy was really spotlighted too for Freedom Summer in its challenge to the MFDP. And so some of these questions around American democracy that are still with us right now. What do we mean by American democracy? When was democracy realized in these United States? What year? Can we pinpoint when that was realized? And we can't. How did Freedom Summer challenge the myths of society when it comes to concepts of democracy? And so when these people courageously went to the DNC to unseat the racist white delegation of Mississippi, which had excluded Black people from the political process, the anticipation was, we are going to show the world that American democracy is corrupt. It is a fiction, but we still have a chance, right? And so at the 1964 DNC, there was an opportunity for our country to go in a totally different direction, because the Mississippi Democratic delegates, they were Dixiecrats, and they were voting for Barry Goldwater anyway. They had already determined that they weren't going to vote for Johnson. They were going to support the Republican, the conservative. And so this was an opportunity for the Democratic Party to say no to white supremacy. And they did not. They did not. And so what ends up coming out of that challenge was the realization that our political system is racist. And so when I think about Bob Moses, who went into Mississippi as the first, SNCC worker down there, and came up with this robust campaign to put a spotlight on Mississippi, and therefore to expand the civil rights movement. and hopefully fight, win justice for all. Bob Moses, who's someone who's not a preacher. And so, kind of soft spoken, but so powerful. People said that they would follow him anywhere, like he was really Moses. But for him to say out of his mouth at some point, like we had to recognize that our political system is racist, that was a moment of disillusionment and deep disappointment, thinking that they would actually get ahead with the MFDP challenge. What's interesting too is that, as Black people travel to the DNC, and I know these pictures aren't, they're blurry, so you can't, it's probably hard to tell, but people showed up and showed out, honored, the civil rights workers who were murdered. And once, to make a long story short, it got to a point where instead of seating the MFDP, they offered them 2 symbolic seats. And Fannie Lou Hamer said, we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. They refused to compromise. And so this was also a question around, when do you compromise? And the MFDP refused to compromise with racism. And while they did not get what they wanted, their efforts did elevate, national and international attention and intervention that ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Judy Richardson there. These were the women who had said that they actually are the true representatives of Mississippi and were running for Congress. Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray Adams, and Unita Blackwell. I wanted to share that I've got The Light of Freedom. Charles Payne is still one of my absolute favorites. It's a long book. At least for college students, it's a great read. It could be a good study over a course of a year, or even just for your own background information. I've got The Light of Freedom is an excellent one that brings out a lot of the lessons from Freedom Summer. Other texts include Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is personal accounts of women in SNCC. A lot of them talk about their work in Freedom Summer. I really appreciate Akinyele Umoja's book, We Will Shoot Back, which documents armed resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement. And this is also an opportunity to talk about the conflict between nonviolence and self-defense. Black Mississippians had a tradition of self-defense because they had to, so they couldn't deal with the nonviolence. And so the way it coexisted in the civil rights movement is something that we have to uplift. Charles Cobb also published a book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, recently, to talk about those tensions. And then I just want to end to say one of my favorite documentaries on Freedom Summer is Freedom on My Mind. It's hard to access. If you want access to it, I do have a digital link that I can share. And so you can put your email in the chat to say you want the link, and I can send it to you, or maybe I can send it to the Dr. Kings, and have that available to people, because it is very difficult to find, but it's still very powerful because it really uplifts the voices and experiences of Black Mississippians who weren't just waiting idly by. They opened up an opportunity for, their leaders to emerge and to speak out. So given time, I'll stop there and open up the conversation for discussion. Anybody want to come off mute? So what are you all thinking? What are you feeling in these times? Is there anything that resonates?
I'll come off mute. Believe it or not, I'm old enough to remember that. But I had a father who left Charleston before he was lynched, and he didn't want to be involved. His children, his 3 daughters, involved in a whole lot. And I do remember following this. And even here in Philadelphia, they had some places where we could learn about what was going on down there. He wouldn't allow us to participate in much. But I'm telling you, those are terrible times. You didn't have to be in Mississippi to be going through what they were going through on site to know that there were terrible times for our people. And even those people up north who thought they had more freedom found out they didn't have the freedom they thought they had. So I will mute myself.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barbara. It was a terrible time. And so for them to still have the courage,
Barbara Ann.
Barbara Ann, thank you. For the people to still have the courage to do what they did under extraordinary violence, the threat of violence, and reality of it, we should be inspired by that in our times. Anyone else have any questions, or is it Shay?
There we go. Happy Saturday, everybody.
Happy Saturday.
And happy Saturday to you, Dr. Levy. Regarding freedom schools, you made a reference, or you said earlier that they still exist in some form or fashion. Is there any scholarship under your umbrella that identifies them in our time? And more so, is there an index of them? Maybe that's a better question. Is there an index of them for our time?
You know, that's a good question. I'm sure I can find, I'll try to find one. I have a colleague, Nicole Burrows, who is at Rutgers right now, but she participated in Freedom Schools and as a young person and created one. Sometimes people, depending on where they are in communities, might run something called a freedom school and it's short-lived. But there have been freedom schools all over this country, whether short-lived, and still some are operating, definitely in Philadelphia, has really been central in keeping the spirit and legacy of freedom freedom schools alive. So I would encourage you even just to start there to see what they've been able to do now. And they have produced brilliant people. I've come across these people who
And
come
they
through
need your
Philadelphia.
support in Philadelphia
Brilliant.
because there really are still freedom schools here. We need your support because it seems like it's getting lost in the shuffle of people wanting other things and becoming more interested in what the world out there has to offer materialize, and we forget what our culture has already enriched us with. There are still freedom schools in Philadelphia.
Thank you. And is it Tamanika? She mentioned that Asala has coordinated freedom schools, and they started talking about returning to that strategy when in Florida, for instance, you know, put a ban on wokeism, critical race theory, and African-American studies. And so people are in Florida right now, have been organizing freedom schools, especially. And so just imagine if we had a plan before this election in terms of, some of us think we need the Freedom Summer. We were talking about this last year. We need to mobilize people. We need to educate them. My students voted for the first time, had no idea that there were other things on the ballot other than the president. Like, we still have so much ignorance around the political system, and we could have employing the idea of freedom schools alone is so critical for political education, but also running candidates. So you hear people in these times always saying, well, you got to vote because our ancestors died for us to vote. And that's true to an extent, but they also tried to change the political system. They also ran campaigns. They also tried to run people for office. And so we have to think about it beyond voting. That's what Freedom Summer also encourages us to do. I don't know that offhand a list of initiatives, but I'm sure if you Google and start with Philadelphia, and as Barbara Ann mentioned, they need resources, for us to support. And definitely Asala, I do recall them putting out a call to do freedom schools in Florida. Thank you for the question. Anyone else? Let me share then some resources that you can utilize in the classroom. The SNCC Digital Gateway has been incredible in terms of documenting their movement, including Freedom Summer. There's a SNCC Legacy Project. There's also the Civil Rights Movement vet.org, which is what I showed you for the resources. And then Civil Rights Teaching, Exploring the History of Freedom Schools, has these packets. Let me see if I can pull it up for an example. So you all see this? Exploring the History of Freedom Schools. So I've used these packets with my students as well. And so if I scroll down here, I can't access it now because you do have to join their mailing list. But they have Origins of Freedom Schools, Students of Freedom Schools, Teachers, and then the curriculum. And so you can use Jigsaw with students to have, groups of students studying Freedom Schools and Freedom Summer from the perspective of students, from teachers, and to actually look at the curriculum and incorporate that in the classroom. And so these are wonderful materials to use to actually, that actually come from Freedom Summer. The SNCC Digital Gateway is this website, has wonderful resources. You can teach through a timeline. Here's from 1962 to 1960 to 1962. And all these things you can click on. The founding of SNCC, Absy Moore, who was from Mississippi, puts voter registration on the table. You can click on 1965 to 62 to 1965. And so all these things are wonderful resources. As you can see, that has the primary sources here on the right, including interviews, videos, and documents from the era. And so this is a wonderful resource. Even if you pick up, so many of my students will say, they're tired of, the one thing that they know about the civil rights movement, of course, is Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and they're tired of hearing about them, even though they don't hear the truth about them. But, there's so many people we need to be exposing them to, someone like Ella Baker. And so here it has the Bigger Than a Hamburger video, and actually, opportunities for you to hear her speak, she was very, very powerful. Again, primary source documents. And so the SNCC Digital Gateway has been really amazing. SNCC also has a legacy project. It's important, I think, to explore SNCC in engaging with young people, because then they get to see themselves. So many of them think they can't be a Martin Luther King. They don't see themselves as something like a leader like Martin Luther King, but you could be, some of these local people who rose up to the occasion to lead, right? Like a Bob Moses. Maybe you are a Bob Moses. Maybe you're soft-spoken, but you could still be powerful and still inspire. And so SNCC, being the youth organization, allows young people to see that high school and college age young people were leading and innovating and did something amazing and radical in the civil rights movement. One thing I thought of just to share with you here, there's a section called Lessons Learned. And so this is be interesting to explore with students as well. And lastly, again, we have the civil rights movement documents. There are also syllabi here as well. Okay, so someone asked for the resources again. So a couple of people are helping me out and putting it in the chat. Thank you very much. So the SNCC Digital Gateway, the SNCC Legacy Project, crmvet.org. And then if you Google Civil Rights Teaching, Exploring the History of Freedom Summer, then you can sign up and you'll get these packets with a wonderful resource of information, lesson plans with students. I want to just then end with the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer, because she is expressing a lot of the things that we're feeling right now, and especially the part, if you all recall from her, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I'll have her have a word here as well.
The whole world is walking up today. Oh, pilgrim of sorrow. We are tired. We are tired of a lot of things. All of them. We are sick and tired of being sick and tired. We have been out there for a long time. Cause all of these people here, we got to do something. And we've been down so long, we ain't got no other way to go but up. It was 40 million of my people destroyed as they was bringing my ancestors here on the slave ships of Africa. I can forgive easily for a lot of things. But when white America taking my name, that was a crime. My name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. You can say, Senator Fannie Lou Hamer, because I'm on my way, baby. Freedom is not something that's put in your lap. You got to stand up. I've been beaten in jail till my body was hard as metal. But I'm not stopping. The flag is drenched with our blood. Because you see, we have never accepted slavery. They know what they've done to us. All across this country, they know what they've done to us. America. Is this America? The land of the free and the home of the brave. I want Jesus to walk with me.
And so this documentary, I think, is also amazing, Fannie Lou Hamer's America, because we get to hear directly from her in her voice as she tells the story of the Civil Rights Movement. There is a shorter version of it that's about 22 minutes, but I still like, you know, if you have time to break it up with students for 50 minutes for the entire documentary is really important. And one strategy I often use too with students in documentaries is to task them to watch it with family or friends or community. The other thing that I wanted to share is that in studying Freedom Summer and teaching it, it also encouraged me to think creatively and innovatively about teaching. And so the first time that I collaborated with Nicole Barrows to teach Freedom Summer, this was, I believe, the summer of 2014. We held, you know, anytime we showed a video, we showed it at a church or a community center or a community space and invited to community to be in conversation. We held a class, for instance, at Mel's Cafe, which was the restaurant, you know, the Black restaurant in Charlottesville, and had Mel himself, the entrepreneur, the owner of the cafe, give his perspective and knowledge and information about the history of Black Charlottesville. We even had class in a barbershop and had the barber who owned the barbershop talk about politics and history and read Stokely Carmichael's What We Want with students. And so there's so much that we can grab from Freedom Summer, including, you know, the idea of mobilizing versus organizing. So what are we going to do when the leaders like Martin Luther King leave the space? You got to make sure that the grassroots organizing is supported in a space. To understand, to question is to challenge, to think about basic set of questions, to challenge the myths of society. To make education relevant was a cornerstone of Freedom Summer and Freedom Schools, but there was also cultural appreciation, historical knowledge, or what we call heritage knowledge as well. That creative expression, art and culture was so important. I think for now, we have to think about parallel institutions. We know that for the most part, a lot of us had trouble teaching Black studies and getting, or Black history and getting support for it in our schools. We could create parallel institutions as we fight to transform these spaces. I think the solidarity from white people is really important too. So as we know from the election, we still need a white movement. We still need white people to organize in white communities to tackle anti-Blackness and racism and patriarchy. And so, again, it also reminds us that the political system is racist, but we have a legacy and a foundation and blueprints for to build our armor. So thank you all for joining and for spending your time with me this Saturday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And the recording will be made available to participants following our presentation today. So.
And again, if you want to link to the Freedom Summer documentaries, drop your email and I'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.